Today you'll hear from Phil Haid, the co-founder and CEO of Public Inc., an innovative agency that has redefined how corporations engage with social issues. With a career spanning over 2 decades, Phil has collaborated with leading brands like Johnson & Johnson, Starbucks, and many, many more, helping them navigate and amplify their social impact. As a passionate advocate for the B Corp movement, Phil believes in harnessing business as a force for good, integrating social benefits into core strategies. And since founding Public in 2008, he has driven the agency to disrupt traditional thinking, proving that social and environmental impact can be key drivers to profit with purpose. Under his leadership, Public has worked with premier clients like RBC, Canadian Tire, and Maple Leaf Foods, and he is also a regular contributor to Fast Company. Can't wait for you to have a listen, and I'll hand it off to Phil. Phillip, welcome to the How I Became podcast. I am so honored to be having you as a guest today and being able to hear a little bit of your story, the company's story, and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Thanks so much. Great to be with you, Kelly. Excited to join you. So I am the founder and CEO of Public. Started the company back in 2008, literally 2 weeks after Lehman Brothers collapsed. So my timing was impeccable. And the idea for the company then, as it is now, was to think about what we call profit with purpose. So it was all about how do we get companies to embed social and environmental impact at the heart of their business. And that was an idea that has currency today, but back in 2008, and especially when the market was imploding, it was a really, really tough sell. But the whole impetus was that I really believe fundamentally that if we were going to transform capitalism, essentially, if we're going to transform the way we operate as a society to tackle the major problems we have environmentally and socially, we couldn't look to philanthropy and just charitable activity as a solution to it, that we really needed to harness the power of business to really solve those problems, not exclusively without the support of government and nonprofit, but the companies had to take a massive role in creating that change. And that wasn't going to happen if they couldn't profit from it. And so that's what propelled me back in 2008 to start the company. And it's still what motivates us today.
It's so fascinating, especially today versus when you started in 2008, very different landscapes. But how did you believe in the idea or that problem statement then when it wasn't necessarily very clear or very obvious to companies? Like you had to do a lot of convincing of the problem, which I think a lot of founders would shy away from something where the problem isn't obvious to the audience that they're trying to target.
Yeah, it's a great question. The impetus for the idea was probably around 2004, 2005, where I was, a job that I had before I started Public. We were creating like corporate social responsibility strategies, programs for companies.
Right.
And what I found was that no matter how much success we had, at the end of the day, we would say, great, we've had all the success with the program. Let's talk about next year. How could we double the budget, or could we at least look at it, 20%, a 30% increase? And what was happening was our clients at the time were saying, super happy with the work, but no, of course we're not going to increase the budget. Or if they did, it was incremental because, the company had grown X. But they weren't really willing to think about how they could 2X or 3X their commitments and their impact, because it was seen as a offset and nice to do to the business, right? It wasn't driving the business. So that was the impetus to say that just can't be the way forward. What was difficult when I started Public was that trying to convince people of this idea, to your question. And what I found happen is I usually got one of three responses from senior executives. I got what you're saying about this profit with purpose idea just feels wrong, because we shouldn't be benefiting from doing what's right and charitable. And I was like, I get it, but you're thinking in charitable terms. I'm talking about impact and business strategy. And so they just couldn't wrap their heads around it. They were just very much old school. We make our money on this side of the equation, then we create a foundation, right? And we give a certain amount of money back to community. That's all they could.
Almost like you feel bad that you're benefiting from doing something good. Like you
Yeah.
shouldn't expect a return. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting
I mean, so you
mindset.
had some who were like, knew that they weren't doing good things. And so it was an offset. For others, it's just like, it's part of what you do to be a good corporate citizen.
Right.
But it wasn't, it was totally separate from the business for the most part. So you had one camp of executives who were like, I don't agree with this. You shouldn't be profiting from doing charitable activity. And I kept saying, we're not talking about charitable activity per se. So that was one camp. You had a second camp who said, this is a really interesting idea, but I just can't be seen in the market to be saying this. Like, I just think that would be problematic.
Hmm.
So they were open to the idea, but just didn't think they could. And then you had a third camp who was basically saying, I really like what you're on. Like, I think you're onto something. I think this is really interesting. However, I am not being judged. Like, I'm not being evaluated. I'm not being compensated by doing this. And so therefore it's a nice to do, not a need to do. And I'm too busy. So please go away. And it was really one of those three kind of reactions. And so it was a constant. I mean, I found like literally for 3, 4, 5 years, I was just, every meeting was an education about not talking about philanthropy. We're talking about how this is part of the business, and then trying to convince. And of course, what people will ask you if they're skeptical is, well, prove to me it works, right? Show me the examples. But when you're trying to introduce an idea that doesn't have currency yet, it's hard, right? So I could point to, Dove already existed, right? And of course, the Body Shop was around, and Lush, and Newman's Own. So it's very difficult to convince people of something when you can't point to countless examples in the marketplace. But what I find in Canada in particular is that new ideas that haven't been proven, we have so much risk aversion in this country that they're just not willing to try. Like, they're not excited to be first. At least in the
Hmm.
US, I find there's more appetite, more desire to be first. It's just in the cultural, orientation of the country. Whereas in Canada, we are so risk averse. So it was a really, really tough sell for a number of years.
A couple episodes ago, Laura Gabor was on the podcast, and they're in the middle of raising for their company, and she was saying she experienced the exact same things. In the US, very open to talking, like ideas, like the problem set, and Canadians, from her experience, are really looking to dot every I and cross. They need to know every single detail so that there's like no risk in investing, which like
Right.
actually
Right.
there is. So
Yeah.
it's funny that you even experienced that when you were starting your business in a totally different world. Like, it wasn't looking for VC, you were looking for your clients, but experienced a similar um element of our culture, our natural culture here.
I think it's a big problem overall. It's certainly in the kind of impact purpose space. I think it's a big problem because so often, you need to lead with your beliefs and your values, and then you just go and make it happen. I mean,
Right.
that's true of entrepreneurship overall, but it's really true in this space. And so it's problematic. I once gave a talk to the AFP, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and the presentation I gave was called "The Race to Be Third," and it was why Canadians, nonprofits and for profits, but like to be third to market with something, right? You don't want to be first because that's way too risky, and even second, that's only one person's gone ahead of you. So once everyone's proven it, then you go into the market. Um, and I was trying to, and then of course, what I did was talk about why we have to shift that, and like here are examples of people who've gone ahead. When I got the evaluation back, everyone hated my presentation. It was so because I think it
No.
was too on the nose, and they're like, "Who's this guy thumbing himself at these Canadians?" But I still think it stands true, and I just constantly frustrated by the lack of courage to push the needle and to think about how we advance these issues in a way that'll drive the business. And um, we're just so risk averse in this country, and I think it really holds us back from being excellent.
Going back to pre-starting the company when you were younger, you had obviously you weren't that risk averse. Like, you saw an opportunity and you were a first mover with it. What inspired you to want to change the world or want to make, you know, um profit with perfect purpose, have currency? What was that
Yeah.
inspiration?
Um, I wish I could tell you that I had some epiphany, some beautiful magical moment that I could create a beautiful TV spot about. I was just sort of pre-built this way. And so my orientation has always been to an interest in how change happens, how to create social change and environmental change. It's just sort of how I'm built. I'll tell you the very short version of this story.
Like,
I was traveling through Asia with a very dear buddy of mine. I had finished my undergrad in political theory, and I read Marx, I read Nietzsche, I read Engels. So I was like very influenced by, I was never a Marxist, but just very influenced by democratic socialism. And my close buddy had studied economics and, was very progressive, but was more right wing than I. And we started our travels. We landed in Hong Kong and we traveled through China. And by the time we got to Nepal, this is like now 6 months into travel. And I was shocked by what I saw, by the way, in China. I'm an old man now, so this was a long time ago. And China was so capitalist. I couldn't believe it. It was like the Wild West of capitalism. So that was like, wow, theory and practice are completely misaligned. But all through this trip, I'm like spouting what I've read in school and so on. And my good friend, he's just such a good person. He was putting up with me. Fast forward, we get to Nepal. And so 6 months of me just hammering him with all my political ideologies. And we were trekking through Nepal, this Annapurna circuit. It's about a 3-week trek. And the last day you climb about 1,000 meters and then you descend into a valley about 1,600. It's a massive day. It's an incredible day. And it's a very, very long day. So finally, we're on the way down into this village and we get to the tea house. We've literally been trekking for about 14, 15 hours and you're exhausted. And the person who led us to our room said, "Can I get you anything?" So we said, "Oh, we'd love, a cup of Coca-Colas. We needed some sugar." And we're lying in the bed and we get the little bottles of Coca-Cola and we like down it. And it was like the most incredible moment. I was so happy to have that Coca-Cola and it was like giving me energy again.
What an ad.
I turned to my buddy and I say, "God bless the multinationals." And it was like literally in that moment that I became a capitalist again. And so I think, I tell you the story because as I think my evolution from kind of, hardcore kind of social change, a little bit more lefty to really trying to push an agenda around conscious capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, right? Net positive economy. My evolution has been where I've always been interested in social change, but I really fundamentally believe, and I think that moment in Nepal had an impact on me, that the way we're going to transform is we have to transform capitalism. It's the best of the worst systems we have. There's so much good in it, but that we are, as citizens, as consumers, we have consumption societies. And so we have to transform how we do consumption. And so, the reason I actually called the agency Public Inc. was that I really wanted to bring the consumer and the citizen and the employee together as one, where, the Inc. in public was that when we can transform the way people behave, and you can be as much of a citizen as you can a consumer in a moment, and we can get you to do the right thing just by living your life. I think my evolution has constantly been about how do we do this by playing with the levers of, of capitalism to make it a more positive thing, because I haven't seen another economic system that has worked better. But
Right.
of course, capitalism is flawed. And so that's been, for me, that was always the impetus for why I created Public and for the work that we do. And philosophically, how we try to just work with companies and engage them to move them along the spectrum to being more conscious, to being more progressive, right? To balance profit and, purpose.
You've mentioned previously about growing up with both Jewish and Catholic guilt and how this
Yeah.
has shaped your
Yeah.
identity. And I'm curious, growing up, what elements of that you think has not necessarily led you to start the company, but driven who you are, and therefore you then created Public Inc. But like,
Yeah.
how did that experience influence you?
Yeah, I would say probably twofold. One is that I grew up in a very kind of liberal Jewish household, like
Hmm.
very kind of, and um, we grew up, as I say, kind of cultural Jews as opposed to overly religious Jews. And but we did sort of take some of the cultural elements that I guess my mom in particular really liked. So we did Shabbat every Friday night. And that was more of a cultural moment for us than it was a religious moment, even though we did the candles um, and said the prayers. But what it was a moment of the week when my mom worked full time. My parents separated when I was young, and she worked around the clock. So Friday night we came together and we just sat around the table and would often have friends of my mom and my stepdad come over, and we would literally spend 2-3 hours at the dining room table and talk about issues.
Yeah.
And so that was a big part of my upbringing. And what's interesting is there's actually data now to show that families who actually talk politics, talk issues, societal issues at the dining room table, you see a much higher level of civic engagement, which is, not some big aha. It seems obvious, but there's actually been research to prove that out. And so that was a big part of my upbringing. It was about talking about issues and ideas and the world. And so I would say the cultural side, the sort of religious, the Jewish side, was both in those traditions, but there's also within Judaism, right, there's this idea of tikkun olam, right, which is about healing the world, as you know. And I don't know, that's always stuck with me, that there is a responsibility as Jews, but I think it's just as a humanist, to look out for others, right, and to think about how to improve things, not just for yourself, but for those around you, for your community and for the broader community. And so that was a big part of our upbringing. And it wasn't force fed with like this sort of stern, like, austere kind of, you need to be responsible. It was just part of, like, it was in the water, as I said.
Totally.
So
Yeah.
that was a big part. That the Catholic part, when we were doing, talking about this before the podcast, was, I joke that's why I'm so screwed up, because like I was a little Jewish boy in a Catholic school, because when I grew up, the place to learn French was the nuns who were teaching. But I think what I learned from that was, as strict as they were incredibly kind, incredibly just people. And I think that a lot of the lessons about social justice, um, and about, treating, those the way you'd want to be treated, and some of the amazing parts of the Catholic tradition and religion that have, the social justice elements and the values, definitely is part of my upbringing as well. And then, of course, the guilt is just, you can't help it. If you're a Jewish mother, you just have to imbue guilt on your family.
Of
Um,
course.
but I do think that formative, like from my education to what we did around the dining room table, um, really sort of just informed my sense of kind of the world and being curious about the world and how other people live. And I'd say the last thing I'll just say to you is, my mom is a psychologist, my sister's a psychologist, my other sister is a guidance counselor, and my stepdad was a therapist. So like it's why I'm so crazy. I was, surrounded by all these therapists, and I'm the black sheep. But what was interesting, jokes aside, was a lot of our conversations were around trying to understand why people act the way they do. And one of the lessons that I grew up with was, um, you know, everybody has a certain amount of crazy in them.
Hmm.
And I don't mean that as a mental illness kind of thing, just like, we're all,
Life. Hmm.
life and our pathologies are all, different varieties of from very sane to quite crazy. But the lesson that I received always was about not trying to default to the judgment of how people act, what they say, what they do, but to get curious about why. And I think that's always stayed with me, because I think the more curious we can be about how people think and act, and when you travel the world, you realize people really think and act differently. Like, it's not, a North American mindset, which of course isn't even a homogenous sense. But when you look at the way people live in China and Indonesia or, in the Middle East, it's very, very different. And so I think you have to take your kind of cultural reference, uh, you have to sort of suspend it a little bit. And I think learning and getting curious about why people think the way they do, why they act the way they do, as opposed to jumping right to, I like that, I don't like that, and judging, is something we could all learn a lot more from. As a human being, I still judge, right? But I think that was a big part of my upbringing. And it really helps in the work that we do, because all of our work is about how to create social change and do it within the levers of economics of capitalism. But you have to understand that everybody operates and thinks differently. So how do you get inside that? How do you get curious? What attitudinal, what behavioral buttons do you push in an audience to get them to take some form of pro-social action? I can trace that all the way back to growing up and the conversations we had around the dining room table.
It's so fascinating. And growing up, and still now, every Friday night dinner we have our Shabbat, and I take the same things away. It's a lot of, you have your whole adult family around you, especially like growing up, and you hear, one, how to have discussions, how to argue, different perspectives, different pieces coming in, and it allows you to kind of start to form your own opinions, or um, be able to ask why. And then, it comes to the four whys that we always
Yeah.
ask. And I love the idea that everything is questioning and being curious. And even I went to Jewish school in the evenings, like Hebrew school.
Mm-hmm.
And part of everything we learned is question the religion, like question every element of it, and then decide for yourself how you want to believe in it or how you want to incorporate it into your life. But funny enough, parallel to you, I went to an Anglican school. So we did and we were more conservative, but just happenstance, I went to an Anglican school, but my mom would still send me with a siddur, and like a,
Yeah,
Bible
sure.
for those that don't know. And I think for me, that also taught me like being different is okay. Like I would go in there and everyone was reading the hymn book, but she wanted me, even though being part of the environment and they loved the school and what I was learning there, to still keep an element of who I am and stand out a little bit. Like it's okay
Yeah.
to be different.
Yeah.
And even that, I think, those elements of being different, I'm sure you felt that as well, pushes you to be more less risk averse. You have to be okay with it because you were kind of naturally pushed into that direction. And I'm curious if you think about those elements and it helped you want to do something that was a little bit different or a little bit outside of the norm to build the company as well.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I don't actually know. I think there's no question in my mind that subconsciously that's the case.
Hmm.
From a conscious level, is that what drove me? Like when I think about starting public and kind of taking the leap, my kids were 2 and 4 at the time. And so, it's doing that and not having, the guarantee it's going to work, and obviously the revenue, and, you've got young kids, it can be quite scary. Um, I think the leap that I took had a lot more to do with an experience I had when I was doing my master's degree
Yeah.
than sort of your point about sort of being different. Because I certainly had the same experience. I, at a Catholic school, and like around the holidays, as an example, like, these Christmas programs, and it was just really religious. And I was just like,
Right.
what is this? Right.
Right.
But I respected it. It was just different. But I think
Yeah.
what allowed me to take the leap to entrepreneurialism was more about knowing that if I take the leap, I will be just fine. And if it doesn't work out, I will be just fine. Right. And having that resilience to know that. And the very short story there was when I was doing my master's, I was running out of money. I just didn't have enough money to finish. And I just didn't, you know, my parents weren't really in a position to help me. I mean, if push came to shove, they probably would have.
Right.
But I felt like I was old enough that I had to kind of figure this out for myself. Um, and I figured it out. I got a job and I figured it out and I finished it. But it was when I was literally counting my pennies going, how am I going to get through this month and then pay my rent? And I didn't have a handout from anybody. And I went and I figured it out. That's when I said to myself, for the rest of my life, I know I can take care of myself. That financially I will find a way. And I think that actually was the moment that I realized later that I can take this leap. And honestly, in my business, at every stage of growth, when I've taken the leap and outside the parameters of comfort, because you have to live with discomfort, it's that having the resilience to know you'll just figure it out. But if you haven't had that experience at some point in your life, and particularly in your formative years, it's really hard to do that. And I think that is, without getting too philosophical, but I think one of the challenges today is that parents want to solve their kids' problems. And it's a real big mistake because you're not teaching your kids about resilience. They will not become entrepreneurs because they won't know that they can take care of it themselves, right? And it's
Mhm.
coming from a good place, but it's counterintuitive and it's actually detrimental. So for me, being able to take that leap had so much to do with figuring out how to stand on my own 2 feet. How do I pay for this? How do I make my way in the world without hoping that mom and dad are going to take care of me? And has served me so well.
Yeah, it's I am curious to see in the next 10, 15 years as the next generation who maybe has had more of a hands-on parenting approach, what innovation and what disruption looks like in the coming years. I also think in boomer generation and a little bit after them, it was a necessity. A lot of people went into entrepreneurship
Right.
because they didn't have another option. So how does that shift when boomers are now transitioning their wealth to the younger generation, and maybe it's not as much of a necessity as it once was?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating, and who knows how it's going to shake out. Like,
Mhm.
people in countries and economies that are more developing, do they actually have the huge leg up because they weren't coddled in
Totally.
the same way than in North America? But who's to say that it could be the opposite, right? I
Yeah.
don't think we know. I think that what we are seeing, of course, is that even if you are taking that leap, if you aren't equipped with those skills and taught those skills or learning those skills on your own, the increase in anxiety and depression and mental and just the variety of mental health challenges, we're seeing it. We're seeing it in youth. We're seeing it in the population overall. And I think it's way too simplistic to suggest that it's that they didn't get that resilience when they were young, but it certainly is a piece of the puzzle, right?
Right.
And what we need, whether you're an intrapreneur or an entrepreneur, you know, we need people to get more comfortable with ambiguity, right? To know that not everything's going to be spoon fed to them, and to go and try to figure things out. And I'm a big believer that making things up, right, that didn't exist before, like like it's not for everybody, but that's the exciting part. And so you got to just forge your path, and you can't be afraid to fail. But if you haven't been equipped with the skills to do that, it's easy to say and hard to do.
Totally. I want to switch gears a little bit. You mentioned like the exciting part and looking at we've talked a little bit about the evolution of maybe entrepreneurship or
Yeah.
what that looks like. But what about the evolution of marketing itself and knowing where it was in 2008 when you started the company to where it is today? What has stood out to you in the evolution of marketing and people's response to purpose-driven marketing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting evolution. If we take actually the period from 2000 to where we are today, so the last 24 years, um, the space has really evolved, right? Because in the early days in 2000, for the most part, marketing and social purpose didn't really go together, right? For the most part. I mean,
Yeah.
there's lots of examples of where it did, but it was very much about doing the philanthropic thing. And then, you would communicate it. But a lot of the communication way back was like check writing, like remember those big, massive checks, and like and then the press release was about how much money was given. And it was all
Right.
about the amount of money. If you think about the evolution, it went from that to when the marketers started thinking about how do we, and the birth of cause marketing. And it was really about how do we merge, a message and an idea to our consumer with something that is philanthropic. And so you saw a lot of these kind of cause marketing programs. And so you start seeing the birth of like, would you, the point of sale, would you like to add $1 to your bill, right? So all that started because rightfully both the nonprofits and the for-profits realized there's a lot of money that can be made. And you
Right.
saw things like, how do we tie product to it, right? So like Red, I don't know if you remember Red, that was
I
created.
don't.
I know. Well, so it's again, totally fine because it's not really, it still exists, but it's not a thing like it used to be. But Bono and Oprah and this organization that became Red literally launched this idea where they created this thing called Product Red, and they basically created a brand all to combat HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, but mostly on HIV/AIDS. And then they got brands, so they got Converse, and they got Gap, and they got like Absolute Vodka, and they got a credit card company. And basically you get these product red. So you'd still buy your Converse, but the red Converse. So you bought the red
I do
iPod.
remember that, yes, and it was, like,
So,
in brackets with red, right?
correct.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So like that was a big deal in around 2000,
Right.
2004, 2005. So that really accelerated the whole product marketing around
Mhm.
this. The evolution continues because then all of a sudden the idea of being purposeful, right? So all of a sudden you have all these companies who are now talking about brand purpose and they're injecting some social purpose into it. And I would say that, it was with good intent, but a lot of it was pretty performative in the sense that they weren't doing anything underneath it. They were just, the marketers got very savvy at talking about purpose messaging because it was new and novel and it was very emotional. And so you sort of saw that. And then it continues to evolve, right? And so you sort of evolve from that to now thinking about, well, how do we market our sustainability across the board?
Right.
Um, and so of course now you start seeing all kinds of marketing communication all around what companies are doing both internally and externally to have an impact in the world, and trying to use that in some cases directly as a competitive advantage, including product sale, and in other cases the way to recruit and retain talent, right? And so there's been this interesting evolution, I think, where we are today, which is challenging for, I think, businesses like mine, is there was so much heat around sort of purpose and sort of the marketing of impact sort of between, late 2020, essentially after the murder of George Floyd, unfortunately, and
Mhm.
then through to 2023, so much energy around being purposeful. And then of course, ESG rises out of, basically the financial sector kind of appropriated, the sustainability idea, for better and for worse. And so there's all this energy, but now with, I would say, both the macroeconomic trends where the economy is in a tougher spot, and then you have a lot of the pushback and the politicization, like we're seeing these things like, go woke, go broke, and all of this sort of pushback that somehow if you are diverse and equitable and inclusive in your business practices and your employee hiring, that all of a sudden that's become a bad thing. And so it's been a really interesting evolution from like doing this as a nice offset or like feeling good halo to actually seeing it as something that could actually drive the business, to now a little bit of reticence on, being careful because they're worried that they're going to get pushback and backlash from, other consumer audience and employee, etc. It's been a really interesting evolution, and we're certainly trying to continue to push the envelope and really guide our clients on bringing that authenticity and transparency to it. But it's been a crazy ride, actually.
I was gonna say the authenticity as you were talking through it, I think is such a big piece because I from some of the campaigns that I've seen that have gotten a lot of backlash, it feels like they're doing it to force fit a good movement into it, and whether it's because they want to start to be more inclusive or more fill in the blank, or they're doing it because they think it's the way because they're buying into purpose driven marketing but doing it in a inauthentic way.
Yeah.
But what is it, ideally from public, but what is a campaign that you're really proud of or that you really stands out to you as successfully demonstrating the value of it?
Yeah. Something that we did that I'm very proud because it actually has a sort of a longer tail on it. There's two that come immediately to mind. So one is we actually worked with the Body Shop a few years back. So they've been. When you think about the Body Shop, you think about animal testing, like from way
Mhm.
back, right? And they brought back this campaign, or they brought back the issue. They've always been working on it, but to try to actually get a global ban on animal testing. And so um, the head office in the UK sort of had this campaign called Forever Against Animal Testing. We were hired by the Canadian team and we were given a certain amount of latitude to think about how to shape it. But
Mhm.
people are busy, right? And it's not that they don't care, but on a relative basis. And so we found we often talk about like the side door into issues. And so for us, when we started to research it, we realized that like 60% of Canadians have a pet. And so we're like, why don't we go through the love of your pet as a way to, tackle the issue of animal
Smart.
testing?
Mhm.
And it worked unbelievably. So, we got a little cute. It was like the petition and such, but like the things that we did though is We crafted the whole campaign around sort of animal influencers, and just the whole thing was around love of your pet. And we showed up at like Dogapalooza and the whole bit. We tied the kind of social impact side of it to the business. And
Okay.
so how do we actually get people into store? How do we tie it to product, right? So to really close the loop to make it profit with purpose. And we did Days on the Hill where we were advocating for it and targeting members of parliament who had, had pets and so on. Why I'm proud about it, and Body Shop deserves so much credit, and they worked with a great government relations firm as well. They actually got finally a ban in this country on animal testing. And so, what I love about that examples was that
Wow.
they had
They led
long-term,
that? Like, they led
they
the
did.
actual full wow.
Yeah,
That's
they did.
incredible.
With a nonprofit partner, but Body
Mhm.
Shop deserves a ton of credit. So they finally got a ban on animal testing. So what I love about that example is we were able to find like a creative marketing way to engage audiences in it, tie it to the business, right? Make it relevant to people as opposed to just saying animal testing is bad. Because most animal testing kind of campaigns were either shock and horror, like show the mutilation of animals, or it was like super cute. And it just like was easy to ignore. So we found a way to make it relevant to our audience. We tied it to the business, and then they stuck with it. And so it had the advocacy, it had the education, it had the marketing, it had the business benefit attached to it, and was really, really successful. So to me, that's like a perfect example of when we talk about profit with purpose. We're trying to merge business interests, societal interests, and do it in a way where the consumer and the citizen become one, and everyone can truly benefit in you know, the initiative.
In that example, was there a goal of, like, increased profit margin or increased revenue or like, did they have a P&L line that they were looking for out of this, or brand awareness, brand trust? And when a company is bringing a team like yours on, is there like a specific theme that they're looking to achieve or a North Star that they're looking to achieve in a campaign like that?
Yeah, I would say sometimes yes. There's always something they're trying to achieve.
Mhm.
Sometimes the metrics are more defined than others. We're always pushing to define the metrics as much as possible because, it's easy to fall in love with your creative idea, and if you get lots of like media attention for you, you think it's a success. But that's not really. I mean, that's
Right.
a metric of success, but it's not the ultimate metric. What I can tell you is we activated in store over the course of a year and a half. First time was 5 weeks, sorry, 6 weeks, and the second time was 5 weeks. And we saw a 17 and 15% increase in sales. So we were measuring
Wow.
it, but they didn't set the goal. They say, hey, we need to get at least at 10%. And part of the reason we saw that increase in sales year over year obviously from the previous year in that month, was because in the past, when they would do social issue campaigns, they never tied it to the business. And
Mhm.
so by tying it to the business, we were able to achieve the dual objectives and dual outputs. There's a whole range that we actually try to map because the
Amazing.
more that we can actually get really tangible on both the business outputs that we're trying to create and the societal ones, it gives us a much more honest appraisal of did the campaign work or not.
There's so much more that I want to talk about, but I know we are at our last few minutes. My second last question. I think as founders, or entrepreneurs, there's so many myths that we're told when we're starting a business. The list is endless. So I'm curious if
Mhm.
there is something that you have heard as you started your business that you would want to dispel for future entrepreneurs.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I'll actually tell you, I don't know if it's a myth or not, but a myth that I actually think is true.
Okay,
I know, so maybe
I
I'm
like it.
twisting your question, but it's what comes to mind. When I started out, I was told, especially if you're building something from scratch and you're not like super well capitalized, right? Because that's an important variable here, that you should expect that it's going to take 10 years to build. Right? I was told that by a number of people, and one person in particular. And I remember having a drink with her. She runs a very successful PR shop, and she said to me 10 years. And I remember when she told me that, I thought, oh God, I really hope not. I thought, I
It's
think
a
I can
long
do.
time.
I said, I was only in year two. I'm like, I think I can do it in five. The hubris of an entrepreneur. And nope, it took 10 years. And And so I say that because I think, um, entrepreneurs are so passionate about what they do and believe so much in what they are trying to create. And you think it's always going to happen faster than it does, but it really does take a long time to build. No one wants to bet on the new thing. They want to bet on the sure thing. And
Hmm.
so I do think as a myth, but it has certainly in my experience, at least, played out, which is it really does take a decade to build. But the biggest predictor of success is your will and determination. And I have found that to be really true, at least in my experience, where, the idea I had for Public was way ahead of the market. And we could have folded the tent so many times. And the only reason we didn't was I so believed in this idea and I was just stubborn and just like pushed and persevered. And I think that, 90% of success is showing up and pushing through it. And I think, you hear that a lot and it sounds sort of like trite, but, it is a true myth that it is so much about the effort and the perseverance and how badly you want it. That's what drives the entrepreneur more than anything.
And I mean, that lends itself right to that 10-year mark, right? Like that's a long time to keep driving forward.
Yeah.
I'd love to dig so much into this, but one question I'll ask around the 10-year, what was it like? I'm sure you had successes along the way. So when you say 10 years to build, what happened in that 10th year, or around there, that made you feel, oh yeah, now I get it. Now I feel secure. Now we have a
I,
company.
I think in my case, because obviously everyone's case is going to be different, and also
Of course.
is your business a product or is it a service? So obviously we're in the service business, but I think what it was is it established a level of credibility and experience where I had enough case studies and people were like, they're legitimate, they're real. There's
Yeah.
enough people who would vouch for us. So word of mouth is obviously the best kind of marketing you could do. And so at the 10-year mark, you've accumulated um, enough experience, enough examples, and you've been around long enough where you kind of seen a lot and you can weather certain, like, the little storms and the big storms.
Last question. If you were to say how Philip became dot 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 fill in the blanks with where you are currently, how would you name your episode?
Yeah, geez, that's such a good question. Um, you know, I kind of toss between two. One is how I became a better leader, because I really, we don't have time on this podcast, but there's been a really interesting evolution in my leadership, and I reference all the mistakes I've made, but like, you don't get taught how to be a leader, and so
Mhm.
a lot of it's trial and error, and it's easy to be great when things are good, but it's the measure is how good are you when things are bad, and so how I became a better leader was so much in this journey. But the other is how I became a social entrepreneur, because, this has been and continues to be an evolution of believing in an idea, believing in a vision about how we transform an economy to make it more just and more socially equitable and more sustainable. And that story is only, half written. So it'd probably be one of those two.
I really appreciate your time and I can't wait to share this episode out.
Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate you inviting me on.